everything you've been told about surviving the brutal American frontier is a lie. We're taught that the pioneers who conquered the wilderness were all hardened, brawny men with axes. But the truth is that the most ingenious survival tactic ever, recorded in the freezing woods of 1800s Michigan, came from a woman named Abigail Sterling, who everyone in the settlement of Iron Creek thought had completely lost her mind. Imagine the scene in late 8040 for where the wind howls like a wounded animal through the towering white pines, and the local farmers, led by a skeptical man named Silas Vance, are all busy building traditional sturdy homesteads while Abigail is doing something so bizarre, so seemingly backwards, that people are actually stopping their wagons just to point and laugh at the Sterling folly, while Silas and the other men were raising standard cabins and then building separate barns out in the fields like any sensible person would do. Abigail was seen dragging massive timber beams right over the top of her existing small living quarters, literally constructing a giant hulking barn structure that swallowed her entire household. Silas Vance actually confronted her one afternoon, leaning against his fence post and shouting over the sound of her hammer that she was wasting her winter wood supply on a roof that would just trap the smoke and turn her home into a giant tinder box. But Abigail didn't even look up from her work, simply wiping the sweat from her brow and continuing to hoist heavy cedar planks into the air. The mystery deepened, because Abigail wasn't just building a roof, she was creating a massive double-walled enclosure with a strange series of internal chutes and a raised floor system that looked more like a fortress than a place to keep a milk cow or store hay for the season. The townspeople whispered that the grief of losing her husband to the previous year, S.A. chill had finally snapped her spirit, leading her to believe she could hide from the sky itself. And they mocked her daily as the structure grew into a strange windowless mountain of wood that loomed over the small clearing. As the first gray clouds of November began to roll in from Lake Michigan, heavy with the promise of a record-breaking blizzard, Silas and the others finished their traditional chores, confident that their separate wood piles were stacked high and their cabins were sealed tight, with mud chinking. They watched with a mix of pity and amusement as Abigail retreated into her barn house and barred the massive heavy doors, disappearing into the dark of her creation just as the first flakes of snow began to fall. Nobody realized that Abigail hadn't just built a barn, she had engineered a primitive, brilliant thermal vacuum that was about to turn the laws of frontier survival upside down. But as the temperature dropped to a bone-shattering 30 below zero, and the big snow of 1844 began to bury Iron Creek, the laughter in the village was about to be replaced by a terrifying realization that their proven methods were failing them one by one. The storm didn't just fall. It descended like a heavy white iron curtain that stayed dropped for 3 straight weeks, burying the valley under 6 feet of packed ice and snow. And this is where the genius of Abigail Sterling's madness began to reveal itself in a way that left Silas Vance and his neighbors fighting for their very lives. In a traditional cabin, once the snow piles up against the walls, the wood stays damp and the wind chill sucks the heat right through the logs, forcing a family to burn through their firewood at a terrifying rate just to keep their water from freezing on the table. Silas Vance woke up on the 4th day to find his outdoor wood pile, his lifeline, completely encased in a solid block of frozen sleep that required a pickaxe and hours of backbreaking labor in the killing cold just to retrieve a few wet hissing logs that produced more smoke than actual warmth. Meanwhile, inside the Sterling folly, Abigail was living in a masterpiece of accidental thermodynamics because her cabin, tucked safely inside the dry, insulated shell of the barn, was surrounded by a massive dead airspace that acted like a giant thermos. Her firewood wasn't stacked outside in the elements. She had lined the internal hallways between the cabin walls and the barn walls with her entire winter supply, meaning she could step out of her front door, grab a perfectly seasoned bone-dry log, and be back at her hearth in 3 seconds without ever feeling a breath of the freezing Michigan wind, because the barn protected the inner cabin from the direct impact of the snow and sleet. Her logs never grew damp, never rotted, and caught fire with a single spark. while Silas Vance was literally weeping in his kitchen as he tried to dry out sodden chunks of oak over a dying ember. The social hierarchy of Iron Creek shifted in an instant when the blizzard finally broke for a few hours and the men crawled out of their freezing homes, only to see a steady, cheerful plume of silver smoke rising from the top of Abigail's massive barn, looking for all the world like a beacon of hope. In a graveyard of white, Silas, with his fingers turning a ghostly shade of blue and his own children huddled under every blanket they owned, realized that Abigail wasn't the one who was crazy. They were for thinking that tradition was better than innovation. He began the long, exhausting trek through the drifts toward her property, wondering if she would even open the door to the people who had spent the entire autumn calling her a fool. But as he approached the massive wooden structure, he noticed something even more unsettling. There were no tracks leading out and the silence coming from inside. The Sterling Folly was heavy with the secret that Silas wasn't sure he was ready to face. When Silas finally reached the heavy barn doors and hammered on them with his frozen knuckles, the wood felt strangely warm to the touch. And when the heavy latch finally turned, he wasn't met with a blast of icy air, but with a wave of dry cedar-scented heat that nearly knocked him off his feet. Abigail stood there looking healthy and remarkably clean, holding a mug of cider that was actually steaming, and behind her, Silas could see the miraculous sight of her inner cabin, glowing with lamplight and surrounded by thousands of pounds of pristine dry firewood that looked like gold in the dim light. She didn't say, "I told you so," because the look of utter defeat and desperation on Silas's face was enough, and instead, she simply stepped aside and invited the families of Iron Creek into the massive buffer zone she had created, which soon became a community refuge for the rest of that deadly winter. This story survived in Michigan folklore for generations because it proved that while the strong were busy following the old ways, the smart were busy rethinking the world. And Abigail Esbar cabin design eventually inspired a brief movement of enclosed homesteading in the upper Midwest. It turns out that by building her barn over her house, she had eliminated the need to ever shovel a path to her livestock or her fuel, saving thousands of calories of energy that her neighbors wasted just trying to stay mobile. The Sterling Folly stood for another 60 years, a monument to the woman who let the world laugh at her while she stayed warm and dry, reminding us that sometimes the most insane idea is actually the only one that works. When the world turns cold, if you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden gems of American history, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell because we're running stories like Abigail S. every single week that the history books conveniently forgot to mention. We're a small channel, and your support truly helps us keep these archives alive, so leave a comment below. Would you have been one of the people laughing at Abigail? Or would you have seen the brilliance in her plan? Thanks for watching and stay curious because the truth is usually a lot more interesting than the legend. Would you like me to generate a thumbnail concept or a list of tags for this?